So you have some characters in your game that have taken a bunch of damage, and the logical question probably will pop into at least one of the players' minds, if not your game master's mind, of what are the long-term effects of this damage. Welcome to the lore of Braunhaven, and today we're going to be talking about wounds and how they can affect the game and the characters. So if you are like me, my typical situation in running a Braunhaven game with Castles and Crusades is to use the optional critical hit charts out of the Castle Keeper's Guide. I specifically use 17.1a for critical hits and 17.1b for critical fumbles, being a nat 20 for a critical hit and a natural 1 for a fumble. There are various critical hit charts available in the Castle Keeper's Guide, and you can select which one you want depending on how much severity you want to impose upon one of those hits. And it should be also kept in mind that I like these tables because they don't necessarily interfere with the natural 20 or critical hits that are delivered through some of the magical weapons in the game, such as like a Vorpal longsword or a sword of sharpness or things like that. These tables kind of interact with that. If the creature is not outright dead and you are going to roll for a critical hit, they can deal additional damage. The other thing that's nice about at least 17.1a and b is that any additional damage from that critical hit is already handled in whatever the random roll is that comes up for that damage. Now, I mentioned that there are multiple different tables in here, and you can use different tables depending on what kind of severity you're looking for. And the reason why I mention that is that what is good for the player characters is also good for the NPCs and the monsters. So if an NPC or a monster rolls a nat 20, they get to roll on the critical hits table to see what the damage dealt to a character is. And same with the natural one. Sometimes I allow my player characters, I allow the players to roll to see what that effect of the fumble is. That way they feel a little bit better about the fact that the orc tripped and fell on his own axe. Now, all of these critical hits in most games, there is no thought given to wounds. If you go back to the earliest forms of D&D or to a current clone such as not Castles and Crusades, we're talking about Castles and Crusades. A clone such as Old School Essentials, there's no thought given to wounds. You take your damage, and rules is written. If you're not at 0 HP, those wounds, given either time or magical healing, will heal themselves or be healed, or you can use optional rules for bandages. But the fact of the matter is that everything above 0 is golden. There's no long-lasting effects as far as the rules is written. How the game master actually runs that can vary table to table. But rules is written, everything above 0, you're still alive, that can be healed. And it went even a step further in 5e in that there are no wounds, and even if you're at 0 hit points, you get 3 death saving throws on a raw natural or on a raw d20 roll that can more often than not save you. If you got best 2 out of 3, then you're good, right? So the idea of wounds never really comes into the game in most cases. In Castles and Crusades, it gives a little, especially if you're using these tables, it gives a little bit more food for thought, because some of these criticals are pretty damaging. I mean, you're talking about eye loss, limb loss, severed arteries, things of that nature. And so all of these critical hits are going to have a logically should have a much longer lasting effect. Now, the natural assumption by most of the crowd is going to be, yes, but we have healing magic, and I don't understand how there would be any disease in the world, or how anybody would have a hook for a hand or walk around with a peg leg. I can explain how that would happen, even in a magical setting. There are only so many clerics, and those each one of those individual clerics only have so many spells per day. And not to mention the fact that in a lot of cases, those particular spells are going to require material components that are usually quite expensive and outside the reach of the average person. And so, if you take a D&D 5th edition campaign, oh, well, why does Bob the Miller only have one leg? Why doesn't he just have a cleric cast restoration on him? Because Bob the Miller can't afford the amount of money that would be required in the material components to give to the cleric. Not to mention the fact that the clerics are probably not high enough level in your average village, thorp, or even town in order to cast such a spell. That, of course, is up to the game master, but it does seem to start to get to be a little bit ridiculous if every town and village you go into has a 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th level cleric there. If that's the case, why do they need 4th level party members to go delve into the dungeon to deal with the cult that's causing so many problems? These things don't add up. And so there is a lot of questions. The other thing to say about that is, disease. The average 5th edition or other player is going to say, well, I don't understand how there could be disease in a fantasy world. There shouldn't be any disease because the cleric can cast cure disease. They only get so many spells per day, and there's only so many of them around. And if you look at the typical pandemic movement, if you look at the Black Plague and how it spread and how quickly it spread, you would have to have a third of your population literally being nothing but high-level clerics in order to keep up with the movement of that virus or bacteria. And so it would be impossible for the clerics to keep up with it. They would whack-a-mole. They would cure one peasant of the disease, and 20 more would crop up around them. They simply wouldn't have enough spells per day to actually maintain that kind of curing system. So no, magical healing isn't the end all be all. And even with divine intervention, gods are omnipotent, all knowing, all present beings. They literally would not have time or thought to consider a mortal life. You are ants to them. They don't care. Occasionally, for whatever reason, they will go ahead and grant a prayer. But for the most part, even with divine intervention, there's less than a 33% chance that the cleric's going to get an audience with his or her particular deity. And so that isn't likely to come in. I mean, one of the reasons that the deities grant these powers to the clerics is because they don't want to be troubled themselves with it. Here, I'll give you a cleric to enact my will in the mortal world, and they can go around and do all the stuff that I'm too busy doing God things to deal with. So your typical deity is probably going to be a little bit annoyed to get a phone call from the cleric with divine intervention requesting assistance. It's like, isn't that why I hired you? Isn't that why I gave you all of these powers? What are you doing? So no, clerics are not the end-all be-all of healing in a pandemic, or even for the lowly peasant farmer who got his hand hacked off. It's just not the way it would logically work. And so then that comes to the player characters. What happens, when a player character receives one of these critical wounds? Like, say they get an 18 on the critical hit table. That's a crushing blow to the skull. They're knocked unconscious. They take an additional 1d12 points of damage. That's probably going to leave some lasting brain damage, which can be repaired with restoration. However, at a high level restoration. However, if they were to lose an eye or a hand, fingers, or an arm, in Castles and Crusades, if you read the spells closely, they don't replace that with restoration. There is only one spell that will, and that is the regenerate spell. And that's a 7th level cleric, 8th level druid, or 9th level illusionist spell. So that's way up there on the list. And it also states that you take the lost limb and you hold it to the stump, and then you cast the spell, and it will knit back together. If the part is missing, then it will take some additional time for the spell to recreate and reform that lost limb. I go a step further. I don't allow the spell to reform a lost limb, but you can make a prosthetic limb that will attach to the stump with a regenerate spell, and it will function much in the same way that the lost limb would. Your results may vary. Like if you're just using a hook, it's going to be a hook for a hand. If you're using a peg for a leg, it's still going to be a peg for a leg. Gnomes have been known to tinker some pretty fantastic Gearworks items that if one of those were attached, then it would be a functional arm. Would look akin to a medieval fantasy cybernetic limb. But that can be used to permanently add it to the character and restore that limb loss. And that can be done with regenerate. Now, it's not just critical hits. I mean, even your most stalwart fighter can be beaten down with just normal hits, and they're okay from up until about -6 hit points. That's all gravy. That stuff can be healed with normal magic. But at -7 through -9, if you look at this, it almost entirely includes the loss of a limb. They're going to lose a hand, they're going to lose a leg, they're going to lose an arm. And part of the reason for that high level of negative hit points is because of the blood loss and the shock to the system. And so in those cases, it's the same. They're automatically taking a critical every at -7 to -9, they're automatically taking a critical each and every additional blow. Now that's assuming that the game master, or in this case the castle keeper, is going to attack a downed opponent with one of their monsters. I don't regularly do that because a downed opponent isn't attacking you. The threat is coming from the opponents that are still moving around, and so I immediately change to a immediate threat. If they are a big bad that just wants to do evil things because they're evil for evil's sake, then sometimes, yes, I will hit a downed opponent just to reinforce the fact that they are evil and above reproach. But generally, I don't. But it does sometimes happen. It can especially happen with in the case of like an area of effect spell, a fireball goes off, and that character that's at -6 and now is going to have to make a saving throw versus that fireball even at half damage. Now they're going to be lower than that -6, so they are going to automatically start taking critical if it doesn't outright kill them completely. And so in all of those cases, they would need to use regenerate in order to reattach or either reattach the original limb or to attach a prosthetic limb of some kind. That's how I do it in my Braunhaven game. And so wounds can have a lasting effect. In our last home game, we had a dwarf fighter that not only was his spleen ruptured, but he lost his left arm and from the elbow down. And so with some quick healing, something to keep in mind is that in the real world, you can be amputated and considered healed. That doesn't mean that you got your amputated limb back. It means that you're healed. So they cast some healing on him. Their clerics were not high enough to cast regenerate, and so they spent a day or two trying to devise ways of permanently, kind of, well, not permanently, but long term strapping his shield of some kind to the stump of his left arm so that he would basically have a shield there and he was kind of a roving tank. Uh, this this is the type of thing that I'm talking about. You need to look ahead and deal with that permanent wound structure, or how that wound structure is going to fit into the game. Honestly, I think that it can lead to better character development. Um, I know a lot of games and a lot of players and a lot of game masters just go ahead and ignore it and move on, just saying, okay, well, they slap some cure light wounds on you, and you're as good as new. That I don't believe should be the case, especially in a critical hit situation or in negative hit points. There should be a longer lasting effect. And so that's how I handle it in the Braunhaven campaign setting, and using the Castles and Crusades rule set. I hope everybody has a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We will likely be off next week, but we will be back after New Year's. Thank you very much, and have a good day.